Okay, this is Nassim Nobari. Welcome to Good Food on Earth's YouTube channel.
Thank you.
And she is the director of Seed the Commons. It's a grassroots organization that works to create sustainable and just food systems that are independent of animal exploitation. You're based in San Francisco, founded in 2009, and you address the root causes of injustice, human rights abuses, and environmental degradation, and promote small-scale, decentralized veganic alternatives to the global corporate food complex by educating the public on issues around the food system so as to empower activists to reclaim our food system. So it's really great to have you, and thanks for coming on. Yeah, thank you. I wonder if we could start with, you had an original name for your organization, and can you tell us what that is and the story behind that?
Yeah, so the first name of our organization was Millahcayotl. The other founder of Seed the Commons might say that I'm not pronouncing it correctly. But so essentially Millahcayotl is a Nahuatl word. Nahuatl is the language that's spoken in central Mexico, the indigenous language of central Mexico. So it was what was spoken by the Aztecs, but it's still spoken today. So it puts together the plural of milpa and then yotl, and milpa is a traditional Mesoamerican agricultural system. So sometimes people just use the term milpa today to really just mean like a field of corn. It doesn't have to necessarily mean any very specific way of doing things. But traditionally a milpa is an agricultural system based on what's called the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. And that's the way that agriculture was done for, millennia in Mesoamerica. And then Yotl is the way. So basically the name is the way of the milpa, sort of like the Tao of the milpa or something like that. And we chose that name because we wanted to, start an organization that focused on changing our food systems at the base as the way to address broader issues such as, inequality and climate change and these things. And, as an alternative to industrial agriculture, we thought, well, we need, a food system, an agricultural system based on agroecology, based on sustainable practices. And so there are many, many examples of that around the world. The milpa is not the only sort of traditional agricultural system where you have, instead of having a field of corn fed with like fertilizers, you have these plants that have a relationship to each other, right? So like in the case of the corn and beans, the corn uses nitrogen. And so what you would have in a cornfield in the US is that you're going to be using fossil fuel-based fertilizers to get that nitrogen. But in the milpa system, the bean is going to fix the nitrogen in the soil, and then the corn uses that nitrogen, so it's sustainable over time. The squash leaves are going to protect the humidity of the soil, and so on and so forth. So there are many examples of that sort of agriculture around the world, but we really liked the example of the milpa because that is a system that originally is a plant-based system. It's not to say that people in Mexico never ate animal protein, but the agricultural system wasn't based on animal husbandry as opposed to examples in Europe where maybe you would have draft animals or you would be using manure. And so we liked the way of the milpa because it expressed that vision of transitioning to an agroecological food system, but also one that doesn't require animals. So we remember that those things are not a requirement.
Right. And that's a pretty exciting thing because I think a lot of people associate being like growing your own vegetables and having your own food, and that has to include animals. But your organization talks about veganic farming. And could you go into a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, and first I want to agree with you that a lot of people just automatically associate that. And I've spoken a lot about why that association exists. And I think that in large part it's due to Eurocentrism, that we don't see the examples of the milpa, but we see the examples of like the cow who produces cheese and then uses the manure. And so when I sort of point out the Eurocentrism of this model, the point is never to say if it's European, it's bad, if it's indigenous, it's good. That's not the point. The point is to just understand why we have a certain bias where we associate these things automatically with animal husbandry, and to show that that's not all that exists. So veganic, basically it's a word that just puts together vegan and organic.
Mm-hmm.
So when we use the term veganic, we're really using it in a pretty broad way. If we're describing, if we're saying, oh, well, there's 100 veganic farms in such and such a place, we're using it in a broad way in the sense that these farms could be sort of large organic farms that have, that are buying their fertilizers and so on, or it could be really smaller scale closed loop systems, more like a vegan agroecological system. So veganic farming, when We See the Commons talks about it, would be farming that both does not use any animal-based fertilizers that you would buy. I mean, animals are going to, wild animals are going to fertilize the soil, but you wouldn't buy things like manure or blood meal or bone meal or feathers or fish emulsion. So these are things that are commonly used in organic agriculture. So most organic farmers are not just, it's not just that they have a few cows and then they're using the manure of that cows to fertilize their fields. That's usually the idea, but it's not the reality. Most people are buying these fertilizers from slaughterhouses, factory farms. And so, that's a problem in many ways, but one of the ways is that we're putting money back into larger scale animal agriculture. So veganic farming is also a type of farming for us that would not have farm animals, being exploited on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean is that if you are a farmer and you have some wheat fields and you're not using any animal fertilizers on your wheat field, but then you also happen to have chickens that you raise and you kill, and some people do that. That does exist. Farmers, for whatever reason, might decide that they don't want to use animal fertilizers, but they're also raising and killing or exploiting other animals. We do not consider that a veganic farm because we consider that the sort of the vegan, the ethical aspect of it is part of the definition. And I specify that because, there's no official, really, there's no veganic label yet in the US, really. So some people would say that wheat is veganic. So you would have to ask people what exactly they mean. Some people would say that the wheat is veganic, and technically it is, and it's good that, there's this wheat being grown where we show that we don't need animal fertilizers, but I'm just specifying how we're sort of defining the term. So a veganic farm, people often ask, well, what did they use as fertilizer? I mean, again, it's broad. Like a veganic farmer could be someone with, 200 acres or someone with 1 acre and have very different approaches. If a veganic farmer is buying fertilizers, what they're often buying is something based on seaweed or grain. I've heard of that, fermented grain. A lot of people are making compost, but I've heard of mustard meal. But typically in our work, when we've sort of brought on farmers to give presentations or when we've interviewed farmers, we're really interested in showing more of a closed loop system where people aren't necessarily bringing fertility from elsewhere, and they might do it a little bit, but where they're having the same approach as this idea where you're going to have a closed loop and you're going to have your chickens and your cows, and that's going, we can do the same in a plant-based system. And so those farmers are really going to be focused on the sort of building the fertility of the soil as opposed to just fertilizing the plants, right? And so things are just going to depend from one person to the other. There's not one thing that a veganic farm would look like. Another difference that I think is not thought about very much with veganic farming, I'll just mention it briefly, is that because a lot of farmers did come from it from an ethical vegan perspective, not everyone, but a lot did. One thing that differentiates them maybe, or that they tried to work on, is the question of pests, so to speak.
Right. Yeah.
How do you deal with that? So, that might be an issue that a farmer is thinking about, like, how can we not set gopher traps or that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like, and when I go back to the original name of your organization, that plants in nature, they have an amazing way of working together to create a healthy soil.
Mm-hmm.
And I find personally, like, we've got our backyard garden here, and we don't use any animal products, and it grows, our soil is so alive, it's so full of earthworms. It was amazing. It was like, it didn't take very long for the soil to get these huge abundance of earthworms. And we just use things like seaweed and composted food, and which is all fruit and vegetable scraps. But yeah, it's what I find amazing is how little it takes and how you just leave things to nature, and you get these plants and fungal systems that work together to regenerate the soil, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Can you address the concept